Shane, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for chatting to me. Where are you zooming in from this morning or this evening?
I do feel really grateful to be having this conversation because we've tried for so long to
We
try and
have.
to pin me down, and I'm actually really I've been looking forward to it. But I've been all over the
Right.
world in all different countries, and I'm now sitting at home in London. So I'm here and I'm loving it.
It's amazing. I'm immensely jealous. I was born in Nottingham, which isn't too far from London, and my entire family, apart from my dad, are over there. And I really miss it. I really,
Come
really
on
miss
over,
it.
come on over. You're always
Yeah,
welcome.
I'll tell
Come
you
and
what,
stay with
mate.
us, and we'll head up there together and we'll hang out with your family.
Thank you. I tell you what, the older that I get, the more I feel nostalgic. And
Yeah.
so it's definitely something which is kind of gnawing away. But is London as beautiful as I remember? It's been a couple of years since I've been there.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do spend a lot of time still in Australia and in the US, but when I'm here, I'm in Notting Hill, so I can't really complain. It's a nice little part of London. It's also coming like into spring, so things are starting to come alive again. We're getting some warmth, and people are smiling and wearing color, which is a really nice experience outside.
I love it. Is there a book, Shane, that you have read that has caused you to stop and reconsider a few things in your life? It could be within your area of expertise, or it could be more broad.
I tend to like reading books that are not in my area of expertise. I would say at my core, I'm a very much a dot connector. So
Yeah.
I love things that seemingly don't connect and then trying to connect the dots between those things.
Right.
And so I try not to read things that are in my genre as much as possible. But I mean, there's definitely there's a few books that come to mind. The immediate one when you said that was it was a book called The Moment of Lift by Melinda Gates. And I thought that was fascinating because I was reading it in a book club with four women, and it's basically a book about what it looks like to understand the some of the challenges women face around the world in different cultures. And it was eye-opening for me because I felt like I had a good grasp of some of the challenges, but it was not only reading some of the challenges for women, but also being in a group of women and hearing them tell their stories. And I was like,
Right.
oh, I thought this was just stuff that I just thought there was surely there's not people in the world that are like that. And then you start to go, oh gosh, like maybe my eyes were not opened as much as I thought they were.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was one that made a big impact.
It's really interesting. I a book that really changed the way that I think about the world, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman. Not sure if you're familiar with his work, but I had the
No.
immense privilege of speaking with him on the podcast. And when I first read the title 4,000 Weeks, I thought, surely that's a typo. Like, surely. And then I did the maths and I've just entered my 2000th week on Earth. And it really made me stop and think and go, okay.
Wow.
It made me hug my loved ones a little tighter and move a little slower. But I would highly recommend that book. It sounds really morbid and sad, but it's actually one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. So highly
Mm.
recommend that. So I'll send you a link to that episode.
Please
It was a
do.
really fun discussion.
But it's always good to have those frame of reference changes throughout your life, right?
Yeah.
When you're immersed in something, and I always talk about this idea of you've been looking at the detail of a leaf, and then all of a sudden you take a step back and you see the outline of the tree, and you go, "Oh my gosh, I've been so focused on this one little minute part of this, and then I've missed this entire kind of big picture that I could be seeing." And it does feel morbid when you think about the limited time that you have on Earth. But when you do take a step back, it does cause you to some of the big problems that felt really big no longer feel really big. They start to seem a little bit more insignificant. All the things that felt really small, you start to realize are really important. So it's good. It's a good perspective shift.
Absolutely. And we're currently on school holidays at the moment. And I've got a kindergarten child and a year two child with me. And I've just decided these school holidays to just enjoy them. Like just to
Mm,
really enjoy my kids. I know that sounds so obvious, but I think
mm.
it's very easy just to rush to the next thing. And so we've just been this morning, we lay in bed for ages and we played Lego on the floor. We went to grab a coffee and then we just took our time. And I think moving more consciously and slowly is something which is
Mm.
really important. And is there something, Shane, that you have changed your mind about?
Gosh, I feel like I change my mind all the time on things.
Like
I
every
remember
day.
someone. Oh, I had this experience once. So I was reached out, or someone reached out to me who was essentially their job was managing kind of media commentators or experts. So you know when you go and you turn on the morning show and there's two people and they're debating a topic and there's an expert in this and there's an expert in
Mm.
that. Their job was basically to represent people to present to the media. And he reached out to me and said, Shane, I've seen your stuff on LinkedIn. I think you'd be great. We should organize time to talk. So we caught up and we had a bit of a maybe 45-minute conversation. And at the end of it, he said, Shane, I'm really sorry we can't represent you. And I said,
Oh,
well, why is that? And he
yeah.
said, the problem is that you are not polarizing enough for people. He said, what we need is someone who has a really strong opinion here or a really strong opinion over here, but you have the ability to be able to see multiple perspectives and sides of things. And as a result of that, I just don't think you're polarizing enough for us. And I remember leaving that interview feeling
Wow.
really, I felt upset by that. And I was like, well, maybe I need to become a bit more opinionated, maybe need to become a bit more convicted in my beliefs. And then I realized later in life that it was actually my superpower. My superpower was the ability to be able to see both sides of a coin rather than feeling like I'm locked into a specific perspective. And one of the things I try to do now is I try to hold beliefs strong enough that they can build conviction, but loose enough that they're able to have my mind changed. And that, I feel like that's a really hard tension to manage. That's why I guess when I say I've changed my mind on a lot of things is because I'm actually constantly open to having my mind changed on things.
And is there something that you're going to stop doing or you've stopped doing in 2025? And if you say with random people in midday in Sydney, I'll be deeply, deeply upset. No, just joking. Is there something that you've stopped doing in 2025? Is it not taking meetings on Fridays? Is it not looking at your phone after a certain time?
Yeah, oh gosh, I wish those were the things that I've stopped doing. Those are the things that I probably should stop doing. There's a lot of things I think that I should stop doing, but I don't. I mean, I was having this conversation with someone who was in an organization who, a couple of hundred people, and they just transitioned to a 4-day work week. And I was talking to them because they were voted as the best company culture under 200 people in Australia. And I said to them, be honest with me, the 4-day work week, are you doing that because you're just going to cram 5 days worth of work into 4 days? Or do you legitimately actually take a 4-day work week? And she said, no, Shane, one of the things that a 4-day work week helped us to do is to radically prioritize what's important to us.
Wow.
And I remember getting off the call and thinking to myself, I would love to do a 4-day work week. And I mentioned it to my wife, and she looked at me like, you're an absolute idiot. You realize you work for yourself and you have the full power to do that whenever you want to do that. And so I jumped into my calendar and blocked out Fridays indefinitely in my calendar and started transitioning to a 4-day work week. And I'm pretty 2025 has been pretty disciplined to that in terms of I don't work on Fridays unless there's a real desire to and something that I'm really excited and passionate about working on. Other than that, I've held pretty close to that idea of making sure that I'm ruthlessly prioritizing my week to make that happen.
Yeah. And Shane, before we begin to unpack some of the amazing work and the fascinating projects that you've been involved in, before we hit record, you said that so many people say that they want your life. I mean, it looks amazing. It really
Yeah.
does. I mean, as you said, working 4 days a week, traveling around the world. I got a notification saying you're in Bali doing a masterclass and retreat soon. I mean, that looks incredible. But what are some of the things that people don't see? Because
Mm.
it seems like the absolute dream. Why do you think more people can just do that?
Yes. Well, this is the idea, right? So someone literally said those words to me via a direct message because I had posted. So last year, to give you an indication, I was on the road for, I mean, probably somewhere between 30 and 35 weeks of the year. So that was between the UK, Europe, Australia, the USA. And some of my trips, so my last trip, I flew from London to Perth to Brisbane to Sydney, LA, Kansas City, Austin, Phoenix, New York, and then back to London again. Now, that in itself seems exciting because I had the opportunity to speak at South by Southwest. I was running a workshop in Kansas City. I was doing a keynote in Sydney. That by nature seems really exciting. And I will say it is. It actually is a really exciting, fun, creative life that I get to live. But I mean, when I got to New York, and this is actually, I haven't shared this with anybody, and I'll share it really, really honestly, but I had an opportunity on the Monday, well, it was the last 3 days. I've been gone for about 4 weeks, and I had an opportunity to go and record a podcast at LinkedIn's head office in the Empire State Building. And I had been there a few years before. The Empire State Building is on the screensaver of my phone, and the opportunity to be invited to go and do that was, well, I would say it's a huge career highlight for me. I remember finishing the podcast, it was late in the afternoon, and I was walking back from the Empire State Building on this absolute high. And I ended up getting back into my hotel room, and I literally collapsed on the floor, and I'm just like, bawled my eyes out for like a couple of hours. And I was sitting there going, this is like one of the most pinnacle moments of my career. And now I'm just going back to an empty hotel room on my own and feeling really lonely and really isolated. And it was this weird elation moment, but also this real like reality check in all of that. And I called my friend and I said, this is the thing you're not going to see on my Instagram. I'm not going to post a video of me crying on the hotel room floor. I'm only going to post the video about doing this podcast at LinkedIn. So the next day someone texted me and said, geez, I want your life. And I texted them back and I said, I don't think you do. And so I don't want it to sound like a sob story because it's not. It's actually a really great life, but you have to recognize that the reality of a high, profile or high performance life is that it also has a shadow to that. And if you don't know how to handle that shadow, it can actually be a really, really tough situation.
Shane, I promise my next question after this will move into some of the amazing work that you're doing.
No,
Um,
I like these
Yeah,
conversations. I'm
I
all
think
for it.
I think it's really interesting because you're right. We only see one part. I mean, I don't post on my Instagram, had an absolutely terrible day, almost murdered both my children. Again, I just don't do that. So you're right. You do post those highlights, but I love that there's
Yeah.
more of a. I feel like there's more of a shift towards authentic conversations around what it's
Mm,
really like. And I
yeah.
was just wondering, Shane, how do you decide what to say no to? Because you must
Mm.
have the opportunity to speak and to be involved in endless projects and some really cool things. And a little bit of a backstory, I really struggle to say no to ideas that are really good ideas.
Yeah.
Like I really struggle to do that. I mean, the idea of going to LinkedIn and recording a podcast sounds amazing. But how do you say no? And also how do you decide which are the things that you focus on now?
Yeah, it's so hard. There's two parts to this. I think the first part for me is what I say no to is made a lot easier when my calendar is full. So if I look at my calendar and I've got a
Great
lot of
point.
work, I've got a lot of income and a lot of revenue, a lot of conferences. If someone reaches out to me and says, "Would you come and do this?" and it feels exhausting, not aligned to what I feel like I want to be doing, it's easy to say no to that. It's not hard. But if I'm looking at my calendar and there's a month where there's nothing on and it's empty and there's no money coming in and all of those things, and there's an opportunity that pops up that I'm not super passionate about or interested in, it's actually really hard to say no to that.
Mm.
Because I mean, there's a kind of almost that sense of not desperation, but that necessity. So I try as best as I can to make sure that I'm as planned ahead as I can be of the things that I want to say yes to. And you plan your yes so that it makes it easier to say no, right? So I try my best to pursue the things that I know are going to fill me, that are aligned with my values, that are going to support me in a financial position so that my calendar feels like it's as full as it can be with the stuff that I want to say yes to, which means if things come in that aren't well aligned, it makes it a lot easier to say no to. The other thing that I've learned has been really helpful for me is that I'm not always good at saying no. So I've learned to say no by saying yes, which sounds counterintuitive. So I normally will say yes if, yes and, or yes but. So, for example, I might be in the USA and someone says, look, could you come and, speak to our team? We want you in person. And I look at my flight schedule and this happened last year. I was flying London, Brisbane, LA, to Florida. And then someone moved an event to basically to go after Florida. And I probably needed it to be like London, Brisbane, Sydney, and then just do Florida. But I ended up flying to Florida, then flying back to Sydney again, and then back to London again. And it absolutely just like destroyed me because of the transit and the jet lag. And I probably just should have said no. But what I've learned to do now is to say, well, yes, I can do that if we can deliver this online, for example. Or yes, I can do that if there's flexibility on your dates. Or yes, I can do that if it aligns with, this other travel schedule I have. So I generally am not saying no. I'm saying, yes, I want this to work, but I have some conditions around which it would work. And I think like if you're you could use it in your own personal life, you could use it in your work as well. If someone says, hey, could you take on this extra responsibility at your work? And you don't want to say yes to it because you know you're overworked. Maybe the answer is, well, yes, I can do that if I can let some of these other projects go. Or yes, I can do that and I'm going to need some prioritization of this. Or yes, I can do that, but I'm going to need some additional support and resources to make that happen. Then saying yes feels a little bit easier in that way.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Shane, there is a whole podcast series in itself on some of those points that you've raised. And something that Oliver Berkman raised, and I'm not saying this is relevant to you, this is something that really spoke to me, was he said that the world is full of insecure overachievers. And he said that to me, and they said that in conversation, and it just hit me. And the
Yeah.
reason why it hit me is because, like, I think I actually really love being busy and I really love
Yeah.
being wanted and I really love being needed. And
Yep.
it was a reminder, I think, to me that this drive that we all have needs to be kept in check because it is a really great thing, but there is also a flip side to that. Like I can get obsessed with things,
Mm.
and I can do good work, but also it's like, what is the true cost, I think, of your commitments? And like I said, I'm not saying that relates to you at all.
I think it relates to everyone, honestly. I think we all probably at some level want to feel validated in our effort, We want to feel like our contribution matters, that it's meaningful. And so the more we can contribute, the
Yeah.
more meaning and validation we can get. There was an interesting study done that looked at what they called the conspicuous consumption of time. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of that
I've
phrase
heard of
before.
it. Yeah.
So the idea was that in kind of like go back a couple of decades, they talked about the conspicuous consumption of money, which is essentially how other people saw how you spent money. So you would buy things typically that were rare. So you buy artwork, you buy sculptures, and you put them in your home. So when people look at them, they go, "Oh, that's a unique piece of artwork that you have? You've obviously spent a lot of money on that." The rarity was associated with value and worth. And then fast forward a few years, now we talk about the conspicuous consumption of time, which is the idea that how people perceive our time demonstrates our value. So let's say, for example, I only have an hour a week of my time, which is free. And you say, "Hey, can I catch up with you?" And you say, "I only have 1 hour, which is free. Therefore, I'm going to give you that 1 hour." You immediately feel like that time is extraordinarily valuable because you only have an hour to give. And therefore, when people say, "How are you?" and you say busy, ultimately what we're trying to do is demonstrate this conspicuous how we spend our time is rare, therefore more valuable. And if you go back a couple of decades and look at, like, this is a good example, you look at go to YouTube and Google like BMW, Mercedes commercials from 20 years ago, and it's people
Yeah.
driving through the countryside playing golf, all those things. The Super Bowl ad for the big BMW commercial is the tagline, what they call the business athlete, and he's sitting underneath a work lamp at midnight, like sketching and drawing that work. And it's worlds apart of what we would consider to be high performers now than it was 2 decades ago.
Interesting. Shane, I'm aware that there is a whole nother side of your life that we haven't talked about yet. So for those that are not familiar with your work, and like I said, I'll put your links to all of your amazing resources in the show notes. Tell me about what you do and why is it something that you commit so much of your time and so much of your energy to?
Yeah, so I always, when people say like, "What do you do?" I always start with who am I? I'm Australian made. I'm London based. I would say I'm curious by nature and a creative at heart. That kind of sums up who I am as a person. And naturally, I'm a learner. And I love learning about ideas. And then when I learn about an idea, it's something that feels abstract. And they're kind of my favorite ideas, things that feel a bit ethereal. I love taking things that feel abstract and ethereal and making them really pragmatic, and then
Mm.
helping other people use them. And so when I started my business, I had spent a lot of time, in front of big audiences of people speaking and kind of leading large groups of people. So when I started my business, nearly 10 years ago, I started by helping people who were in positions of leadership know how to communicate an idea that mobilized and rallied people. And I guess it's summed up in this quote, which is this quote that says, it's been said that when Caesar spoke, men wept. But when Cicero spoke, men marched. And I liked that idea. Like, what I was doing was helping leaders communicate in a way that caused people to mobilize and march. And I did that for a few years. And what I found was that a lot of people, when they stand in front of a group, especially public speaking, they get nervous. They don't really know what to do. So I gave them a really pragmatic process of how to communicate their ideas. And so I focused on communication. Then fast forward a few years into my career, I started, noticing that I was talking to people in my role, and everyone was talking about culture this, culture that. We need to work on our culture. Culture's this. And I started asking the question, well, what is culture? And I got this really ethereal, abstract answer to it. And
Mm.
I immediately, as a learner that loves this stuff, went, that's what I'm going to turn my attention to. So I pursued this weird abstract concept called culture. And I said, I'm going to make this pragmatic for people, and not just for people who are leading organizations, for like frontline leaders, the people that are dealing with teams every single day. I'm going to make this super practical and pragmatic for them. And then as a result of that, I wrote my second book, which is called Let's Talk Culture. And it just went so well that it kind of created this platform for me to be able to work with organizations and teams now to help them to create culture by design.
Shane, it's an awesome book. Really
Thank
is.
you.
I can only imagine the amount of work that went into it, but it is a really great book. I've got a copy on my desk and I usually don't write in books, but this book is just full of post-it notes and scribbles and it's a great book. And why should we talk culture? Because it is something which seems so abstract and hard to pin
Yeah.
down. But I know the answer to this because I've read the book. But why should we bother talking about something which seems so hard to pin down?
Yeah, it feels a little bit, I've described it a bit like a fish becoming aware of water. Like it's a thing that we've been immersed in our entire life. And probably if you're listening to the podcast, at some point in your career, you've probably used the phrase, "I love the culture" or "I hate the culture."
Mm.
And I think when you experience really really good culture, it's not just the thing that you feel. Like, yes, you want to show up to work on, they say culture is, how we feel on Sunday about going to work on Monday. There's all these other kind of like taglines for it. But when you're in good culture, you want to bring your best to work every day. You're more engaged at work. And there's a sense of feeling like you belong in the organization. But most people, what they don't realize is that culture has very pragmatic impacts on a business as well. So we ask people, where does culture influence? And so they said things like psychological safety and trust in the organization, revenue and profit, achievement of organizational goals. They said things like attraction and retention, like employee engagement. Pretty much every area of your business or school or not-for-profit or charity, any area of your business is touched by culture. So if you get culture right, it's the thing that will actually change and have tangible impact across a business. So it is abstract by nature, but it's pragmatic by outcome.
And I mean, I have the privilege of working in schools, and I have worked in many different schools over my career. And culture is one of those things that I remember that each place and each leadership team and each classroom has its unique and distinct culture. And the
Yeah.
place I'm working at now is just this phenomenal school. And the culture there is that people want to be there. And your book
Mm.
really made me sort of think about what is that? Because we describe it and we assume that everybody knows what it means.
Mm.
But I agree, it's this abstract thing, but it's something which is fundamentally important. I mean, in your work, Shane, like what do you notice about organizations that have a really healthy culture, and what are some of the things that organizations do that don't have that strong, robust, healthy culture?
Yeah, it's interesting when we use the language of healthy culture because I tend to like I understand what we mean by that is typically what we mean is much more functional as opposed to dysfunctional behaviors. So I would say, a team where people are constantly talking about each other behind their back and, tearing each other down I would not say is a healthy culture, but I would also say it's more so about dysfunctional behaviors. And the reason why I try not to use healthy versus toxic is because what is considered healthy in one domain may not be considered healthy in another. And I use this example, like if we were to take the culture in the military and look at what is healthy in that context and take that and put that into a school, it doesn't translate. It's not going to be the same what we would consider to be healthy culture, or take what's taking place in a hospital and put that in a tech startup. They're not necessarily translatable. So what I tend to use rather than what is a healthy culture is I always ask like, what is a well-defined culture? And what is a culture by design rather than by default. For me, organizations that do culture well are not necessarily the organizations that don't have bad behaviors. They just have really well-defined um, uh, rules of belonging. I'm going to use that term. That's actually a term Fiona Robertson, a good friend of mine, wrote a book called The Rules of Belonging, which I love, which is ultimately about like, what does it take to belong here? And when I think culture is strong, it's that every single person in your organization knows what it takes to belong in that organization.
Wow.
And I'll use one last example of this. Someone asked me, do you think like Tesla has a toxic culture because of Elon Musk? And I said to him, like, I said to the person, I think some of the behaviors that are considered normal in that organization, I would hate. I would not want to be a part of. However, he's never shied away from saying what he expects of people, and people opt into that, knowing what the expectations are up front. And I would say that that's probably the best case outcome is not that that you don't have bad or those what you would consider bad behaviors. It's that most people join an organization not knowing that that's an expectation, and then it becomes part of the culture and no one addresses that, and then as a result people feel tricked almost into kind of being part of that organization, and that can kind of create some really bad results.
Yeah, and so what are some of the implications for workplaces that have a undesirable culture? Does it really impact um,
Mm.
productivity? Does it really impact morale? What are some of the things that you've noticed?
All of the above. I mean, there's a good friend of mine, Alicia Mackay. She talks about this idea that in organizations like this, where there's not that strong, healthy culture, they have 3 meetings rather than 1 meeting. And I always really like this phrase. And she said, in the organizations that have 3 meetings, there's the meeting before the meeting, there's the meeting, and then there's the meeting after the meeting, which is usually like it's people who like they'll get together before and they'll create alliances, they'll talk about things, they'll set things up, then they'll have the meeting. They don't say what needs to be said in the meeting because there's this undertone, there's not safety, there's not trust, there's not all those kind of things that are working together. And then afterwards they get together to debrief everything that happened in there, to talk bad about what happened in the meeting. And
Yeah,
so
great point.
when you see culture not at its best, for example, when there's not a culture of psychological safety, you have those 3 meetings. And so naturally people feel more distrusting, they feel disconnected from the leadership team, they feel disconnected from the organization's purpose, they feel generally disengaged. And ultimately, a lot of the impact of culture is felt after. So a lot of HR people will typically measure organizational success of their employees through engagement surveys. So we want to know how engaged are people, and then they measure that. The problem is an engagement survey is a lag indicator of culture because they're ultimately measuring the impact of good or bad culture on engagement. Whereas
Yeah.
if we get culture right, we should see a tangible shift in engagement as a lag consequence of that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about that before. So, Shane, who's responsible for culture in an organization? I know once again that is a whole podcast episode, but I have the privilege of being in a leadership role at our school. Is it my job as the school leader to establish culture, or is it more of a shared responsibility, or a little bit of both?
Yeah, I mean, if you ask people, they're very passionate. If you ask, I call them culture crusaders because there's people
Yeah.
who have very firm beliefs about, culture. And you ask some people they will say culture is everybody's responsibility. Other people will say culture is the leader's responsibility. And I asked 1,000 Australian managers, said who's responsible for setting culture, like leading culture, sorry, designing culture, leading culture, living out the culture every day, and then addressing all the cultural inconsistencies. And basically what happened is that cascades down in people's opinions. So when we
Mm,
say who's responsible for setting the culture, most people say it's the leader of the organization. So that could be the principal, it could be the CEO, it could be the chair of the board, whoever is leading that organization, they've got a responsibility to set it. Then they said who's responsible for kind of leading it. That was the C-suite or the executive team. And then the next question was who's responsible for communicating it, living it out every day, and addressing all the cultural inconsistencies. And that basically everyone believed it was the responsibility of frontline managers or middle managers.
yeah.
So my answer to that is when you look at that holistically, everyone plays a really important role. So who touches the most number of people in the organization? It's not the CEO, it's not the head of the organization, it's your frontline leaders. So when you think about it, like as a principal of a school, you have a connectedness to a small group of leadership team and maybe like the ad hoc interactions with students, but who are the people that actually are touching the most number of people every day? It's your teachers in classrooms. It's your people who are actually in lunchrooms together. They're actually having a significant influence on the culture. I always say this. I say culture is really shaped by your frontline leaders and your managers, but leaders have a disproportionate
Mm,
influence on culture. So if you have a manager group or a teaching group or a frontline group who have one kind of culture, and then you've got someone who's in a leadership position espousing a different kind of culture that they're not living, this layer will not respect that culture because they would say it's espoused but not lived. They have a disproportionate weight attached
yeah.
to the leader of the organization.
Interesting. What are some things that destroy culture in an organization? I'm sure you have had the privilege of being around and seeing a variety of different ways that organizations work. And yeah, what are some of those sort of things that really undermine an
Yeah.
organization?
So we got 5 culture killers that we identified in our research. The first, and these are not surprising. When you hear them, I'm like, of course, these are culture killers. The number one culture killer was a lack of trust. So when people said that trust was absent, they said it killed culture. And this makes sense. If you can't say what needs to be said, if you can't connect in a way that you need to connect, it's ultimately going to impact your culture in a bad way. The second thing was absent or disconnected leaders. So one of the things I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this actually, because I remember a mentor of mine, Matt Church, was talking about because he worked with schools quite a lot, and he was asking people what they believed was one of the most important behaviors for building culture in a school was, or to connect and feel like people are connected with the school. And he said that the principal could do, and he said it was ultimately to stand at the gate during drop off and pickup.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Um,
research into that.
yeah,
Yeah, and
and,
I, sorry, you're saying?
no, yeah, please, yeah, go. I'm curious to know because I've only heard the headline for that.
Yeah, and schools are my world. And as I mentioned, I've had the privilege of working in a vast array of schools. And I can say, hand on heart, that this one that I'm currently in has the best culture of any organization I've ever worked in. And my boss is phenomenal. And she stands
Mm,
out in front of the school most days greeting the kids. And I think on the surface, I remember seeing that and thinking, isn't there something that's more important that she could be doing? Like in the sense of like, there's got to be some like high level
mm,
leadership things. There's got to be something that is more valuable. And then she spoke to me and said, like, this is actually the most important thing I have to do today.
Mm.
And that's greeting students, that's addressing them by name, being visible. And so I think that there's a whole range of research that's gone into that and what builds a positive school culture. And I think one of the things that I really try to do with my team, and I definitely don't get it right all the time, is I'm just not going to ask them to do something that I'm not willing to do. Just not going to do it.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so if I say I need this done by this date, or this is the standard that I expect, I have to do that. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes like being willing to be called out on your own BS is a really good thing, and it makes
Yeah.
me step up. And another thing that I do, a really great, a wonderful mentor of mine, and you may know him, a guy called Dave Reardon. He lives in Melbourne. Him and his wife were involved for many years with a local young adults ministry. And he said this one thing to me because I was getting a bit flustered. And he goes, just remember that nobody shouts, nobody runs, and walk with your head held high. And by that, what he meant is very rarely do you need to shout because it's very rarely an emergency. Very rarely do you need to run because unless the building's on fire or some kid's on fire, everything's going to be okay. And also look up and connect with people as you're
Yeah.
walking. So something that I really try to do every day is to go into every classroom. I connect with the kids. My office is right outside the classroom, so I get to see kids. I invite them in to have a chat. And so I don't know if I've answered your question, but there's a number of things that we can do at a school level
Yeah.
that really builds that culture. And I was really moved when my principal said, actually, this is the most important thing I have to do today. And that's standing out, greeting kids. They're not a disruption. They're
Mm.
not like an aside. Like that is from a school's point of view, that is our core
Yeah.
business. And then, of course, the question gets raised, when do you do your prep? Well, not during school time because we're there for the kids, So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. It's interesting,
No,
but
it makes sense to me. Yeah.
yeah,
I have a friend of mine who was in stepping into his first leadership job, and I asked him, I said, "How's it all going? How are you finding being in leadership?" And he said, "I feel like I'm just struggling to get my job done because I'm constantly being interrupted by people." And I said to him, "Mate, I'm really sorry to tell you this, but now people are your job.
yeah.
Like it's not that they're interrupting you to get your work done. It's that they are now a core part of what you do."
Yeah. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work by Dr. Adam Fraser. You're nodding, no one else can see this,
Yes.
looking at the video.
Yes.
He's been really instrumental. He works in the leadership space in schools, and also he has a concept called the third space. And I work about 45 minutes away from where I live. I work in Campbelltown. And he talks a lot about those transitional spaces between moments, between re-engaging with your family. And I can't tell you how many times I've stood outside the front of our door and said, okay, how do I want to show up now? I've got
Yeah.
30 seconds, switch from being school leader to dad. How do I want to show up? And that has been transformative because when we think about culture as well, and this is why your book was so and continues to be so transformative for me, I think a lot about the culture of my home with my kids.
Mm.
Like I want our culture, and it's not always like that because sometimes it's crazy, but I want them to come home and go, our home is a safe place. Our home is a
Yeah.
place that I felt like I can say what I thought. Our home is a place that I can come back to when everything falls apart. And our kids are young, so
Mm.
they're not doing anything too crazy. But I think about that a lot, about what are the
Mm.
sort of unspoken feelings and unspoken streams through which flow organizations and homes. And I know I'm
Mm.
digressing slightly, but I think your work is so applicable into not just organizational spaces, but much more beyond that. It's really interesting.
I agree. And I wanted, before I forget, I want to let me quickly say the last three things. If you listen to the
Please.
podcast and those are the top two culture killers. Next ones were negativity from team members, which I
Yeah.
like what you just talked about there, is actually intentionally deciding how you want to show up into the
Mm.
space. So the absent or disconnected leaders, the lack of trust, negativity, unclear and unrealistic workload expectations when we put too much on people. And the last one was like a lack of accountability, where basically we tolerate things that we shouldn't tolerate. Like these are the things that people told us are gonna kill a culture. But what I want to touch on, what I like that you talked about there, is the idea of a family unit being a representation of culture. So much of when I was writing the book for organizations, all what I was thinking through was about a family unit. And I was trying to think through the experience of how do you learn culture growing up in your family? And everything about your culture in your family is typically looks like this. You basically grow up and in your family you say, hey, in our family, this is what we do. Like, and you explicitly have to tell a child, we say, for example, we say, hey, when someone gives us something, we say thank you. And when, we ask for something, we say please. And that might be a really clear expectation that you have of a child. And you have to explicitly tell them, otherwise they don't know. And so when you clearly articulate that expectation, they then have a very clear behavior that they can follow. And then when you give them language for that to say please and thank you, they now know how to talk about it. And therefore, what you then do as a
Yeah.
parent is when they say please, you reward them and you praise them for that. And when they don't say things, if they snatch something, you, hey, we say please and we say thank you. And you kind of correct them when they
Interesting.
don't. So the whole five culture conversations that are in my book are around expectations, clarification, like communication language,
Yeah.
confrontation, celebration, are basically how we learn things as a child growing up to learn to fit and
Fascinating.
belong in a family unit.
It's fascinating. And I, like I said, I have the privilege of being in so many different classrooms. And what is so unique to me is that every classroom has a different culture. And that is something which has been co-created by the teacher. That is something which has been created by the students. It's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
And every single person that I've spoken to on this podcast, and I'll ask you this question in a minute, I asked them about who their favorite teacher was and why. And no one in the 201 episodes that's been recorded have ever talked about content, have ever
Mm.
talked about what they learned in that class. They've talked about how it felt. And that really speaks to culture. Like I know my teacher, Mrs. Jones, when I went into her class, I felt seen, I felt valued, I felt like I was the most important student in the room. And of course, great teachers do that to hundreds of students. So I think that idea of culture being something which is it's not as evasive and difficult to pin down, I think, as most people may see, because it is something which is
Yeah.
very real and very experienced. But I digress, Shane. I think there's so much in that. And just because I said I would ask you, who was your favorite teacher at school? And
And immediately knew who I was going to say. As soon as you said that, it was a teacher that we called Bodie. Her name was Dominic Bode, and she liked being called Bodie, and she was my film and television teacher
right.
in my senior years. And it's funny because I actually only messaged her just recently on
Yeah,
Facebook.
wow.
We're Facebook friends, which is like how you know that now I'm 37 and I'm still friends with on Facebook with my high school teacher. I was a bit torn between two. The other was Mr. Warhurst, who was my art teacher in junior high, and he was the kind of guy that I could go and spend a morning tea or a lunch break with, and I loved that about him. But Bodhi for us, you hit the nail on the head. It was not because her class was fun or cool or her content was great. To be honest, I can't remember a lot from film and TV.
Yeah.
But what I always remember is that she felt like she was a friend to us whilst maintaining a really good boundary of being the teacher.
Yeah.
And she never made us feel like we were young, stupid, immature. We always felt like we were treated like responsible people. And I always remember that. She was just a really, really kind human being. And so, yeah, I really, really, really loved my experience and with her.
I love that. And what did both of their classrooms feel like? What was the culture of that place? Were risks encouraged? Was there a standard set? Like, what was that like?
I think for me it was about, and it's funny because when I went through senior high, I thought I was going to be a doctor when I finished school, and so I studied maths and science. So I basically had straight math science subjects, and then I started to fail chemistry, and then started to realize I didn't want to be a doctor, and so I dropped chemistry and took on film and television. And art was something that I dropped, and I wish I had gone on and done more of it because it was so it's so much a core part of who I am. That's why I always say now I'm curious by nature and a creative at heart because I realize that's part of my strengths now. And those experiences for me, they were both creative classes, and I think maybe that's probably why they aligned with me. They felt like I was given freedom to be creative, whatever that looked like. It didn't need to look like everybody else. And I think teachers who allowed creative expression were not people who said you need to be creative in a particular way. It was people who gave you freedom to be creative as you saw it to be creative. And
Yeah.
both of them were exactly like that.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Shane. And I think there's so many parallels between what you shared about your experience in the classroom and also really healthy organizations where
Yeah.
creativity is encouraged, where you feel like you have a genuine connection and genuine trust and relationship with the people that you work with. And Shane, I'm just curious with your experience, how do we balance like empathy, approachability, and high performance? Because, like, how do we, as people that are leaders in organizations, set those standards where they need to be, but also
Yeah.
support people in a loving and empowering way? I really struggle with that. I think that's really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, there's also I think there's a misunderstanding of the business value of empathy. Business Solver is an organization that does an empathy report once a year, and
Wow.
I don't have the statistics on me. I wish I did, but there's some stats that basically talked about CEOs and their belief about empathy. And so many CEOs are embarrassed to talk about empathy as a skill because they believe it's soft or it makes them seem weak. And the thing that I feel like with empathy is empathy is often seen as fluffy or soft, but it's actually a really strong skill set when we use it right. Because I think there's a fine line between someone who demonstrates empathy and someone who is a pushover. Because I
Mm,
think empathy doesn't lack boundary. So, for example, if someone on your
interesting.
team makes mistakes, you can empathize with them and see that they've like made a mistake and recognize that it's okay that they took a risk and they failed, and at the same time hold them accountable for the mistakes that they've made. And I think there's this doesn't have to be one without the other. So empathy makes the relationship strong, but accountability also makes the relationship strong. So I think we've got to get that tension right between those two worlds together.
Yeah, and I agree, and I've really experienced that in the school that I work in, where there is a very, very high standard, and so there should be. Like
Yeah,
we are educating young minds, and parents are trusting us with the most precious things that they have. So the standard
yeah,
should be exceptionally high, but also there's a care and compassion. So I think for the first time in any organization I've been in any school, I've seen that both can coexist at the same time. It doesn't need
yeah,
to be one or like we know where that standard is and we are constantly trying to reach it, but also there's
yeah.
grace and there is kindness mixed into that. I think that's
Yeah.
really, really
It's the
important.
idea if like if a child's about to walk out onto the road in front of a car and you grab them by the arm and you hurt them as you like yank them back onto the sidewalk, you would say that you did the kindest thing that you could do for that child by hurting them in that moment. And you didn't
Exactly.
intentionally try to hurt them, but it was actually kind and compassionate. And
Yeah.
I think, we often think that if someone makes a mistake or they stuff things up, that we're being empathetic and compassionate by not holding them responsible or accountable to that. And it's actually not kind or compassionate to do
Yeah.
that. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do for a person is to hold them accountable.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've learned one of the many things I've learned in years of leadership is I used to think that things would just resolve themselves. Like you just it'll be right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't. It doesn't.
Yeah.
And I think I'm getting a lot better at having those, as Brene Brown says. Brene Brown says she talks about kindness, about being clear as kind. And
Yeah.
I've learned that it is actually to hold people to have an expectation and to hold people to standards and be really
Yeah.
clear about that is kind. And I think for me, the times in my leadership where it hasn't gone particularly well is because I wasn't clear. And that's on
Yeah.
me. That's on
Yeah.
me. Shane, I
Which
want
is
to be
usually the foundation of culture, right? Which is why I always talk
exactly.
about the
Yeah.
starting point to every culture conversation is a conversation about expectations, which is what do we actually expect of one
Yeah.
another? Because if not, we're open to interpretation. And my favorite
Yeah.
quote is by Toria Letter that says, "What isn't communicated is felt. What's felt is interpreted, and what's interpreted is often inaccurate." Don't make people read between the lines. Have a clear conversation about expectations.
Yeah, I love that. Shane, I want to be respectful of your time. So just
I
a
could
couple
chat all
more.
day. I blocked out the rest of the day. Let's just keep this going.
I would love to. Look, we've definitely, I think, paved the way for a round two because I have so many questions. And so feel free to come on at any
Anytime,
point to
absolutely
have a
anytime.
conversation. A couple of questions just before we wrap up, though. For those people that are listening to this that feel like they are in an organization that isn't a healthy culture, how do we fix a broken culture? What do we need to do? Do we stay there? Do we quit? What do we do?
Yeah, I always say to people like try to remove binary in choices because Matt Church always said this as well. Like two options is not a choice; it's an ultimatum.
That's right.
And so whenever there's two things, always try and add a third. So the decision is like, do I stay or do I go? Is very binary.
Yeah.
Whereas what about the third option? What if you stay and actually try to change things? Or what if there's always other alternatives. It always is going to come back to the psychological safety that you feel within that environment. If you don't feel safe to have a conversation, it's going to be really hard to change things. And so, for example, I always say if you're in an unhealthy culture, you can change it from anywhere you are in the organization. Part of the reason why I wrote the 5 conversations in the book is actually showing you how to shift culture just through day-to-day conversations. So, for example, have a conversation about expectations and really be explicit. What do we expect of one another here? Because there's a misalignment of expectations here. Then articulate that in really clear behaviors. And once you know what those behaviors are, then you can create language around those behaviors to talk about it. And then we can celebrate the good and we can challenge the bad. What I would say is if you're in an organization where you don't feel safety, you can move up through layers of challenging dysfunctional and what I would say is dysfunctional behaviors and culture. The first way to do it is to start with really kind of open with questions. So, for example, go to your leader and say, hey, let's say your meeting culture is really horrible. Everyone talks over one another, everyone's angry at one another, everyone cuts each other off. I would go to the leader if you didn't feel safe to say, hey, we've got this dysfunctional behavior here. I would go to the leader and say, hey, I would love to have a conversation with you about what you see as being our norms for our meetings. Like, what's a great meeting look like for you? What does it sound like? What does it look
Right.
like? Ask the question and let
Yeah.
them articulate it so that when you go to the next meeting, you're going, I'm noticing that there's a disconnect between what you really want and what we're actually doing. So questions are like the foundational. The next one you can do is make observations, which is to say to the leader, hey, can I make an observation about what I've seen in our culture? I've noticed this behavior, I've noticed this behavior. It requires a different level of safety. Once you can kind of get to the higher level of safety to move from observations, you can go to like statements, like where
Mm.
you say, hey, we're cutting each other off and actually it's not okay. We need to do better than that. And that's really comes from a deeper level of safety. And ultimately where you can get to once you've got the highest level of safety is you can directly challenge. It's different to be able to walk into an environment when you don't feel safe and say, hey, you're being a jerk, you need to change your behavior. You can do that when you've got a deep level of trust and safety. But if you don't have that, you would say, hey, tell me a little bit more about like what we need to be doing here. What should this look like? What's the best version of us showing up today? So I would say work your way up through those layers if you're in a healthy culture and try and change it. And if
Yeah.
you can't, then yeah, I would say try to find a space where you're going to thrive.
Yeah, I love that. Shane, final question. Where can people find out more about your work and reach out and start a
Great
conversation
question.
with you?
I hang out on LinkedIn. Basically, you can find me at Shane M. Hatton, M for Michael, Shane M. Hatton, pretty much anywhere. If you want the professional version of me and the best version of me, you're going to find that on LinkedIn. If you want the more personal slash business version of me, you can find me on Instagram. And if you want the unhinged version of me, I think there's some version of me on Threads somewhere, but I don't really use it anymore. But yeah, Shane M. Hatton everywhere you look.
Shane, it's been an absolute joy having a conversation with you. And thank you so much for your honesty and also the amazing work that you're doing. It's been really transformative to me personally. And I know that there's people out there listening to this podcast that would really benefit from that. So thank you so much. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I was actually going to say the same thing to you. You mentioned you recently crossed 200 podcasts, and I know from having hosted a podcast how much effort goes into facilitating conversations that are going to be helpful for people. And I don't really think you fully appreciate the impact that this podcast has had on people. And so hopefully, if you're listening to the podcast, what's the most valuable thing is to just drop an email and just
Yeah.
tell you how it's helped. That is it means the absolute world to me when I hear things like that. So I'm sure you would appreciate that from people too. So
Thank you so
drop an
much,
email.
Shane. Really appreciate it. Thanks, mate.
Thank you.